Teledon was supposed to be the internet before the internet. Invented in the 1970s by the Canadian government, it was a protocol for piping computer graphics into people's homes from central servers that were connected to TVs over the phone lines. The idea was that people could dial into central servers using augmented TVs or special terminals to be entertained, do shopping, banking, and find someone to hook up with, all using digital graphics. Things got pretty weird when artists got their hands on the tech and started creating early hypnotic computer art. There's also a reason you've probably never heard of any of this. In 1985, funding was cut for Teledon research programs, and the trials with Bell in Canada and AT&T in the US were finished. After that, it wasn't long before Teledon faded into complete obscurity and its art was gone. But some of it survived. The bold, primitive shapes and colors and the slow, hypnotic way they load on the screen, a limitation of the technology itself, immediately caught my eye. All I could think was, what was this thing? And why had I never heard of it? I first encountered Teledon at a screening of early Canadian computer art curated by Clint Enns, a PhD student at York University who discovered Canadian artists in Teledon on an old magnetic tape here at VTape.
VTape is a distribution center for videotapes, for video art, and it's the largest distribution center in Canada.
So what did you think the first time that you plugged Canadian artists in Teledon in, having, not even known about Teledon before?
I was totally blown away, and it had an aesthetic that I hadn't seen before.
Teledon was interactive, right?
Yeah,
yeah. You dial in.
These might even be considered early examples of net art, right? So it's like you dial in, and all of a sudden you're watching these videos or going to people's homepage. One of the nice things about this is that it was like lots of spatial studies, lots of color studies, lots of trying to see what the medium could do. For these reasons, I feel it's a very important piece of Canadian history.
Do you feel that, obviously it's 30-some years after this thing happened, and even back then it was primitive and it had a lot to do with old computer art, but do you think it matters now?
I think historically it matters now, but I also think like just listen to the soundtrack on the Canadian artist and the Teledon. That soundtrack has dated really well.
Yeah.
And I think you see a lot of this type of animation in contemporary computer animation. So I think it holds up.
Clint isn't the only one who's held on to relics from Teledon's heyday. Paul Petro was general manager of the Toronto Community Videotheques, a hub of Teledon art activity in Toronto during the early 80s. During the decades, he's held on to artifacts from the Teledon scene, and he keeps them in his downtown Toronto art gallery. So, what do we have here?
Right here, well, we have some works that I'd produced using Teledon technology back in the day. These sort of came out of the work that was in the Canadian Artists in Teledon video.
Decades later, after all this work has been done and it's kind of disappeared, Canadian Artists in Teledon is, we've looked, we've asked people, and really it's kind of the defining document of what we really have.
I think I made the tape in order to bring audiences to an artist's work, and that's what I still do. It's all about that at the end of the day.
Yeah. When did you figure out that it could be used for art?
We kind of figured that out right away. It was all about the tele-shopping and the tele-banking and the tele-everything, right? That was the sort of government-driven, market-oriented goal of the technology at the time.
So looking at all this stuff decades and decades after it was originally created and you've been holding on to it, do you feel anything? Do you think anything about it?
It's always held personal value for me, and I think now I'm realizing it holds value beyond that. We can talk about how things change, but we can also talk about how things don't. And so it kind of invites those kinds of questions, like how far have we actually traveled in this kind of accelerated world that we're living in.
I headed to the birthplace of Teledon art, Trinity Square Video, to meet some of the originators of the scene, Nina Beveridge, Nell Tenhoff, and Bill Perry. So let's talk a little bit about what Teledon was meant to do with the sales and banking versus what the artists, such as yourself and Nina and Nell and Paul, were doing.
Corporations were trying to find out what they could do with this. They had an impression, or they had the feeling that this was something that was coming down the tubes and they better get on top of it. They never did, because before they knew it, the internet came and it was a completely different ballgame. I think the corporations were just experimenting, and artists could do what they wanted.
So when the internet came out, did you think of Teledon?
Oh yeah. Teledon became a part of what's known as the North American Presentation Level Protocol syntax, which is the 6th level of the internet standard. For quite a while, Teledon was buried in the internet.
So why did Teledon disappear?
Because it was not relevant to what actually happened.
At home, people hooked their TVs up to a special decoder that could receive Teledon graphics from central servers. Users dialed into Teledon servers with a keypad, a little bit like how we access web pages today. What do you think was Teledon's legacy?
It's a footnote, it's a technological footnote in the development of the internet. And it's a demonstration of what happens when government, industry, and artists all collaborate together.
You know, at the time, it was never really going to succeed other than as a field trial. And it became essentially a kind of tool for artists to explore until it gently faded away.
Yeah, there seemed to be a ton of hype around it, you know, people saying it'd be the future or this or that. Did you ever buy into that?
I was very turned on by the idea that it would be great to get as many artists as possible to access these tools and see what would come out. Mm-hmm. As far as any legacy that Teledon has left, I really think it's basically a foundation stone, perhaps, in the development of many great performance and video artists and other digital entrepreneurs that are out in the world today.
So what are some of the works that you were creating?
The first one was called Us and or Them, and which was about the Cold War. We were fed so much propaganda about our side being right and their side being wrong and bad. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. So let's see, what if you looked, you know, what if you put it into question a little bit more? It was that sort of idea.
So what was it like working with Teledon?
Well, it was a bit of a struggle. You had to be a real sort of graphic artist to figure it out, right? Like, how would you make a portrait of a face or anything, right?
So a lot of people, including yourself, have kind of made this comparison between Teledon and what the internet eventually became. So I'm wondering, you know, where do you see that comparison?
It's actually not the internet per se, it's the web, because the internet was already functioning. But the World Wide Web, you know, with this graphical display of stuff and an interaction with it off a keyboard, it's very close. You might not see that now so much because the web is very sophisticated, but in the beginning it wasn't. In the beginning it was just a bunch of graphical pages that, you know, branched off, right? With
GIFs of dancing babies.
Yeah, in the beginning it was pretty simple. You know, because it wasn't commercialized, it just sort of like, you know, just essentially stopped. You had to have this page creation system and go through all these complicated machinations to get yourself up on a public database. The internet was founded as a system where anybody could write a page of HTML code. I mean, that was just magic, you know. It's no wonder that it was the thing that flew, whereas this is like, what? You know, why would you, make it that complicated?
So what was Teledon's legacy?
I think it's just these few people who were like the champions.
We had the original tape of Canadian artists in Teledon and the hardware to play it. Since some of the artists hadn't seen moving Teledon graphics in decades, we played it for them to get their reactions to see something that was lost long ago come back to life on video.
That's nice.
This is so weird.
It's beautiful though, isn't it? It's moving art.
It is.
It's like, and the canvas keeps changing, and it's, you know, there's a beauty to it.
We look at it now, it seems really amateur. At the time, it was, you never saw stuff like this coming out of computers.
I mean, looking at this stuff, like, are these good memories?
I mean, I was just out of university. I wasn't worried about finding a job. I knew I was going to find a job. So I was just going to have fun exploring technology and working with all these great artists and meeting all these neat people. It was fantastic. It was really fun.